Okay, I think we can get started now. I'd like to welcome everyone to our presentation today on developing a real estate strategy for small businesses. My name is Charles Bishop. I'm a volunteer as a mentor with the SCORE organization. For those of you who are not familiar with SCORE, it's an organization sponsored by the SBA whose goal is to foster and develop small businesses, whether they are in a startup phase, an operational phase. The SCORE Westchester chapter serves the small business community through the free mentoring services. We have over 50 volunteer mentors who have different areas of specialization who are assigned as free consultants to those businesses who would like to take advantage of the service. In addition, we have educational events such as the webinar we have today. If you are interested in taking advantage of the mentoring or educational services, you may reach us through the phone number that's listed on the page here, or through our website, which is score.org/Westchester. In addition, if you'd like to be apprised of upcoming events, you can follow us on the various media platforms that we're on, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Before turning the meeting over to our presenter today, I'd like to present a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, everyone except for the panel will be muted during the presentation. In addition, the chat feature is muted as well. If you do have questions that you think of during the course of the presentation, I would encourage you to use the Q&A button, which is on the Zoom toolbar. That way we can compile the questions and answer as many as we have in terms of the time after the formal presentation. In addition, we normally get a question on the slides. There will be a copy of the slides emailed to you. Included in the slide presentation is a slide in the back, which has the SCORE contact information, as well as to request a mentor link, which you can use if you want to take advantage of the free mentoring services. Today's webinar is a popular topic. It's on developing a real estate strategy for small business. As you can see, we have a number of areas that we would like to cover. I would like to go ahead and introduce the speakers so we have as much time for the presentation. We are fortunate to have with us today Andy Herz. He is of counsel to the New York law firm of Patterson, Belknap, Webb, and Tyler, where his focus is on practicing real estate leasing, acquisitions, and financing. He is also a recipient of the New York State Bar Association Real Property Section Professionalism Award and a member of the American College of Real Estate Lawyers. Andy holds a BA and a JD from Columbia University, and he has also served as adjunct professor to Vanderbilt and Brooklyn Law Schools. With that today, it's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Andy.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for inviting me here. So let's talk about real estate. Real estate is a hot topic for everyone. It makes very good cocktail conversation. But for you who are starting businesses or growing businesses or even shrinking businesses, these are important subjects. We're going to cover a number of topics. Let's start with the strategy issue. You are a tenant. Presumably, this is not something you're used to being. In most instances, your landlord will be more experienced than you are. Landlords are professionals in leasing space to tenants. And I always talk about the big landlord lie. The big landlord lie is they'll shake your hand and say, I hope this space works for you. In fact, the landlord hopes quite the opposite. The landlord hopes the space doesn't work for you. Because if it doesn't work for you, then you either need to get out of your lease obligation, which carries certain obligations, or find additional space for you, which gives the landlord an opportunity to sell you more product, if you will. Although you are generally starting a business, the landlord's looking at many different factors. And you have to analyze what you plan to do in your space. You have to have a business plan. You have to figure out how long do you think you're going to be at this size? And what are you going to do if the size you start out at isn't the same size as what you end up needing? One of the questions I ask is, do you even need a lease? In the state of New York, and we're only going to cover situations which are applicable in the state of New York, because leasing space and real estate law is a matter of state law, and it varies from state to state. So even though I won't be quoting chapters and verses of state law, it's applicable only in New York. So do you even need a lease? In the state of New York, you can have an oral lease for less than a year. The issue with an oral lease is, how do you prove what the landlord agreed with you? Well, much of what we are going to be saying today can be written on the back of a napkin. In some ways, it's better to use something other than a napkin to record your agreement. So think about what are the most important criteria for your first location. And don't let your head get too big. You know, usually startups are underfunded. So can you afford to give employees, if indeed there are other employees, individual spaces? Are there common spaces that will be used by all the employees? You know, while it might be nice to have a ping pong table in the middle of your common space, generally a landlord will charge you for that. Are you going to need parking? Are you going to need a sales area? And what is permitted and what is the landlord going to give you? Charles, the next slide, please. So one of the first questions I have is, do you really need a lease that demises or gives you exclusive possession of your own space, or can you share space? There are many types of businesses where you can share space. Some businesses are not utilized 5 days a week or 7 days a week. Perhaps you can share that space with another startup. These are things to think about. So there's also the opportunity to move into a cooperative space. For sake of convenience, we've called it a WeWork type space. Now, if you've been reading the newspapers, you may have seen that WeWork is a company that overexpanded and is having a difficult time. We've left this slide as saying it's WeWork space because we want to point out that it's not just your credit that's important. It's the credit of the party that's leasing to you? Do they own the building? Are they themselves a tenant in the building? And what are they offering you? A lot of this has to do with how long you plan to stay. And beyond that, which we'll see as we go on in this presentation, is how much capital are you willing to commit? If you move into a space and it requires you to do alterations and or pay a broker, these can be fairly large expenditures. If you just need a place to hang out with a phone and a copy machine, a WeWork type shared workspace can work for you. So too, if they can make available a common conference room, even a common coffee machine. So you need to know how long you plan to stay, how you're going to grow, and what you need to be offering people you are going to hire or bring in as independent contractors into your space. Now, I mentioned alterations. One of the alterations you may want to make is to put locks on your door. On the other hand, it may not be permitted in a WeWork space. If you say, I want my space cleaned, you have to make the space accessible to who's ever doing the cleaning, and they will need access. And that doesn't mean your space can't be secure, because it can be secured by having a locked filing cabinet, a locked closet, or the like. So the shared space agreements are fairly standard. The lessor, which is the landlord, will say, here's the agreement, you have to sign it. We're not authorized to make any changes. Sometimes that's true, sometimes that isn't true. Now, we know if you're going skiing, they say, well, you're agreeing to all the terms and conditions of assuming liability on the back of your lift pass. It's not always true with a WeWork space or a shared space. You really have to read the agreements in their entirety. They're not long. It's not a big burden, but you can't assume because somebody told you about it, even if it was me, that you don't have to read things. And if you have trouble reading, you're going to have somebody read it to you or translate it, because these will be binding agreement. Charles, next one. Okay, so how do you find space? You can find space any number of places. You can see a space available for rent on a window on a vacant store. That may or may not be your best option. So the question is, do you need a broker? Sometimes a broker can be helpful. But as I said, a lease for less than a year can be an oral agreement. So too can the hiring of a broker. If the window says, call so-and-so, the broker, and you see the space with the broker, you're going to be deemed to have hired that broker. If you go through the space and you say, I don't think that's quite right, and the broker says to you, oh, but tell me that if you lease any of the 3 other vacant spaces on this block, that I will be your broker, you've just hired that broker to represent you in finding your space in those locations. So how do you find a broker? There are many ways to find a broker. One is to look in the window and see what broker's name is there. You can ask your friends who've had similar experiences. If you have a lawyer you're planning to use, you can ask the lawyer, who have you had good experience with? Now, a broker will want to be hired on an exclusive basis. That means if you lease any place, you've hired them in each such situation. Do you need one? If you think you found the perfect space and it says for rent by owner, you don't need to hire your own broker. If the broker has an exclusive with the landlord of that space, that broker is going to get a commission whether you hire them or not. They will have an agreement with the landlord that you won't be able to circumvent, because they will have a written agreement with the landlord that says, if we lease that space, we will be paid a commission. Now, the commissions are generally a percentage of the rent. Depending upon where you are and how long the lease term is, will determine how much the broker gets paid. The broker is generally paid by the landlord. That doesn't mean you, as the tenant, don't have an interest in whether or not there's a broker involved, because if a broker is getting paid, it will be built into the rent. All things to think about. And there's no reason not to ask your friends if you can learn from their experience and find out from them what they learned. So one of the first things a broker will do is give you their form of exclusive agency agreement. These can be tricky. They can last for a lot longer than you think. They can even cover a situation where they get a commission if you end up buying the building that you lease in, should you be so fortunate. You need, again, to read their agreement carefully. Next slide, please. Do you need a lawyer? The answer is a lease is a contract. In the state of New York, such a contract is binding unless it is fraudulent, unless it is void, is against public policy. So you can read a lease. And the other part of reading the lease is that if unfortunately you end up in court, the courts are empathetic to tenants. So you are not going to find a situation where your landlord can come in the middle of the night if you miss paying the rent and lock you out or hold on to your possessions. That is not allowed in New York. There are some states, like in New Jersey, where they can lock you out. But we're only talking about New York today. So if the landlord says, have your lawyer call my lawyer, that doesn't necessarily mean you need a lawyer. If it's a relatively short-term lease and you understand the financial terms, as well as the services being provided, you may be able to get away without hiring a lawyer. But you should ask the lawyer, what are you going to do for me? At a minimum, the lawyer says, I'm going to read the lease. I'm going to confirm all the major terms. And when I read all the major terms, I'm going to confirm them to you. If, for example, the lease says, my cleaning service is going to clean your premises, the space you lease, every night, and this is what you're going to pay for it, you should be aware of that. But we'll talk about the financial implications in a few minutes. So you're going to say to the lawyer, what are you going to do for me? The first thing is to confirm the major terms. The next thing is to say, what are you going to charge me? It's not unusual for lawyers to charge you a flat rate for a relatively small lease. But that doesn't mean you can continually bother the lawyer and call the lawyer in the middle of the night whenever you think of another question. To the extent that you use the lawyer efficiently, you will get a much better response from the lawyer. Usually the lawyer will have you sign an engagement letter. If it's a very small transaction, the lawyer may not require an engagement letter. But it's not a bad idea to have an engagement letter, because that spells out exactly the terms of the hiring, what the lawyer's going to do for you and what they're not going to do. The lawyer's not going to visit the premises unless you've agreed that the lawyer's going to visit the premises. And just because the lawyer has an office above the premises you're thinking of renting, doesn't mean this is a good lawyer to choose. There may in fact be a relationship between the lawyer and the landlord. You should ask the lawyer, what experience do you have doing transactions such as this? What experience do you have representing tenants in this type of business. If this is a restaurant or a store or an office, different problems present themselves. Although we haven't broken it down for this webinar, for example, in a restaurant, you have to vent, get rid of grease, get rid of air, potentially want to use the sidewalk. All of these are issues. So if you're going to be leasing space for a restaurant, you should find out that this lawyer has experience doing that. And by the way, you don't just have to ask friends who they used as a lawyer. You can walk into a restaurant or a similar business in the area where you're going to lease and say, who did you use as a lawyer? Was that lawyer helpful? What did they charge you? Would you choose them again? And they're either going to tell you or they're not going to tell you. But it never hurts to ask. And this is all free advice, which you should not be afraid to ask. Next slide, please, Charles. Okay. So here are some important non-financial aspects. Who will the tenant be? This is a very important question because the only person who can be sued or held liable for the tenant's failure to perform its obligations under the lease is the tenant. Not the principals of the tenant, not the brothers of the tenant, not the lenders to the tenant, unless they issue a guarantee. So you may say, do I need to set up a corporation or a limited liability company? Although it's beyond the scope of this webinar, it's not a bad idea because that will limit your liability to who the tenant is. The flip side is that that's all that the tenant can look, the landlord can look to. So the landlord may say, oh, this is a newly formed entity with no assets, so I want a bigger security deposit. Please be prepared for that question if you're setting up an entity that has no assets. Next is, where is the space? You should try and find out as much as you can about the space. If you're familiar with the neighborhood, that's good. Is there construction planned? And if there's construction planned in the neighborhood, is it going to block your view? Is it going to reroute traffic if you're looking for traffic? Do you need to be on the ground floor? Because ground floor space is usually more expensive. Except surprisingly, landlords like to have ground floor space occupied. So if they've had a hard time leasing ground floor space, they may give you a favorable lease term, especially if there are floors above it, because they want to show that there's activity in the building. There are many relatively new buildings in Westchester where the ground floor space is not occupied. and they're looking to rent apartments above it. That has an effect on what the rent will be. Now, then, is the space vacant? If there's an existing tenant in the space, that sounds as if it may be an issue. But as I mentioned, courts are favorable to tenants. So if there's an existing tenant occupying the space and the tenant does not leave at the end of their lease term, you may not be given possession when that tenant's lease is over. That may be a situation where you should be alert to what the landlord is going to do to get rid of the existing tenant. And you should think, well, maybe this is a little more complicated than I realized. And maybe this is a situation where I do need a lawyer. Is the space built out for your needs? If it's space you can just move into, that's great. If it needs to be divided, who's going to pay for that? If a storefront has to go up, if new signage has to go up, who's going to pay for that? I can assure you in the end, you're going to pay for it. Because the landlord's looking for a return on its investment. And as I said before, can you make it larger? Can you make it smaller? A landlord likes to hear that the space worked for you initially, but doesn't work for you thereafter. Because that means either you're going to need additional space, or you're going to need to shrink your space. Think about how those things will happen. If you're going to potentially need more space, you may be able to put the additional space you need on the second floor. Perhaps you could put your office and non-selling space on the second floor. And if you have a retail business, put that on the first floor. And you can hedge your bets by either putting all your space on the first floor initially, or having an option or a right to expand to make it larger or smaller. Now, the next issue is, how long is your term? By term, we mean the length of your lease. The lease term is important because that's the period in which you get to occupy the space. If the landlord is giving you free rent, you may be able to have a free rent period, usually at the beginning, in which to make alterations or get your business up and running. And can you renew? This is, again, another situation where you may want to use a lawyer. Because if the lease says you can renew the term, but only if you've never been late with your rent, that may be a heavy burden. But under all circumstances, you can't get away without understanding the lease. Whether you have a lawyer or not. Can you terminate early? Well, that's very similar to shortening your term. For the tenant, and we're trying to stress it here, the goal is to be able to make the box that the landlord gives you bigger or smaller. Bigger in space, bigger in time, smaller in space, smaller in time. And one of the ways to make it smaller is to sublease or assign your lease. If you sublease your space, it means you are still paying the landlord the rent for all of the space. A sublease is a transfer of less than all of your rights. It may be less than all of the space, which means you've put up a wall, and you have to make sure that that's legally possible under the local building code. Or it may be for less than all of the term. You may say, it's more than we need at the beginning, and we signed on for what we hope to grow into. So let's initially sublease a portion of the space, and that way we can grow into it. But you are still primarily responsible for all of the obligations under the lease. To assign the lease means you are transferring all of your rights under the lease. You then become secondarily liable, which means the landlord will look first to the transferee, also called the assignee. And if there's a default, the landlord will first go after the transferee, assignee, but they still have the right to come after you. Both subleases and assignments are at a lesser rent in virtually every situation. Unless you spent a lot of money fixing up the space, you're going to charge the subtenant or the assignee, the person with whom you as the tenant enter into a sublease or an assignment, less than you are paying. Nope, not yet, Charles, because I skipped ahead, thank you. Which is what uses are allowed. This is important. Depending upon where you are, you may have restrictions on uses. Those restrictions may be contained in the law, which says you can't have this kind of use in this area, in this zoning district, or there may be a restriction saying no other delicatessens in this shopping center. You have to know what those are, because those are important clauses that somebody else fought for to have in their lease. Now let's turn the page. Thank you. Now we get to the money. Some of this is self-explanatory. How much is the rent? When does it start? does it change? Rarely does rent go down. Is the landlord going to give you money to build out the space? Do you post security? There's certain requirements if you post security. The landlord has to keep it in a segregated account. It isn't money the landlord can spend. And another alternative, to give the landlord assurance that he will get paid or she will get paid, you need to ask right at the beginning, it's one of the major terms, do you require anybody to guarantee the lease? It's better not to ask that question. It's better to have the landlord tell you, because the landlord says, oh, I didn't think of that, depending upon how sophisticated the landlord. So here are some other things to pay for. Electricity, cleaning your premises, increases in landlord's costs, and parking. So let me just hit upon these very briefly. Electricity is furnished to your premise generally in one of three ways. Either there's a direct meter from the utility company to your space, in which case you as the tenant will get a bill and may have to put up a security deposit to the utility company. So don't forget about that. Or they can put in, or have you put in, a sub-meter which measures the electricity cost of the electricity furnished to your premises. And in some cases, they have a method in which they can calculate the value of the electricity furnished to you, called rent inclusion. That can be complicated. So if you get such a clause, read it slowly. Cleaning may or may not be included. If it's included, it may be included whether or not you're using the space. And they may have cleaning specifications which are rarely followed. Increases in landlord's costs generally don't apply unless you have a lease of more than 2 years. Because one may be a base year against which they measure increases. But for a longer term lease, paying your percentage share of increases in costs can be significant. Parking you may have to pay for, among other things, because the landlord may have given the right for parking to somebody else. Next slide, please. Due diligence, which means finding out for yourself what can bring you down. Does the landlord own the building? If the landlord doesn't own the building, you need to find out who does and what the landlord will do if the landlord terminates the lease of the party that you are getting the space from. If in difficult times like these, the landlord owns the building, but the lender starts to foreclose, if you're only going to be there for a year or two, that's not so terrible, because foreclosures in the state of New York is a very slow state to allow foreclosures. Are there environmental problems? This is a difficult one because there may have been underground storage tanks that weren't properly removed. They may still be there. There are websites that can be checked, but that's not an easy process. And finally, what does the law permit? What does the law permit in terms of signage? What does the law permit in terms of outdoor seating? In terms of a restaurant or food use? What does the law permit in terms of banners? All of the law enforcement for spaces in New York are governed by the applicable building departments. And they all have different philosophies, some of which, despite the laws, loosely enforce them, some of which are strictly enforced. Every once in a while, you'll read an article saying 7 building inspectors indicted for taking bribes. The only thing I can say is don't be one of those people who pays bribes, because you're going to be one of the first that the building inspector under examination from the district attorney is going to turn in as paying a bribe. Charles, are we ready for questions?
Yeah, let me go through the Q&A section. First question is, if you have an Airbnb arrangement, how is that affected in terms of a leasing structure? What should you do in preparation if you want to do some type of business activity like that?
That's a hard question. And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. We were talking about commercial uses. An Airbnb is a residential use. And there may be different requirements, and they are evolving in the different jurisdictions. So really is not much I can add, except to check with your local business building department, which you can do on an anonymous basis. You know, a friend of mine is thinking of having an Airbnb. What do they have to know? But I think it varies from village to village or town to town. And I wouldn't hazard a guess on what any particular jurisdiction will require from time to time.
Okay. We've had a couple other questions in terms of if you're using a buyer broker, what type of arrangements are those for the fees? And is it a one-time charge, or does it vary, or how's that structured?
Okay, so we're talking about commercial leases. The commercial leases, it does vary. It varies upon the length of the term, and it is always paid by the landlord. It gets built into the lease rental, but there is no such thing as a buyer paying a buyer broker and a tenant paying a tenant broker for leasing commercial premises. It's a percentage of the rent.
So those are set fees, or is there a negotiation that you can do?
There can be a negotiation. You know, they may say, well, it's 6% of the first year's rent, and it's 4% of the second year's rent. You know, the bar to being a broker is not that high. The brokerage commission fees are not set by statute. They're wholly subject to negotiation. And you know, if you get a large real estate firm, they're going to say, this is what we charge for that. But we won't vary that. A broker who's just starting out, working on its own. And by the way, we have salespersons and we have brokers. To become a salesperson is not that difficult. To be a broker, you need more experience. And salespeople have to work for brokers. So if they have to get approval from the broker who is experienced in running a big company, there may well be less flexibility.
Okay. We had another question, Andy, that came in on what are the landlord's responsibilities in a triple net lease arrangement?
Okay. A short-term triple net lease is unusual because it means, and there are all sorts of definitions of triple net leases. Triple net lease essentially means the tenant's responsible for all of the expenses relating to the property. Now, if you're renting for a year and it's a triple net lease and the sidewalk has to be repaired and it gets a violation and that falls upon the tenant, that can be very expensive. So a business just starting out, signing a triple net lease can be very onerous. You have to pay all the expenses. You know, a leak in the roof where the roof has to be repaired, that becomes the responsibility of the tenant. So I would think if you are starting a business and you don't have a very rich backer who's willing to pay whatever the trade may call for, stay away from a triple net lease.
Okay. We also had a question that came in that said if they're looking to buy a particular property that is residential with non-conforming commercial use approval, and it's currently designated as use for a medical office, and they would like to continue to do that, but they want to know, you know, what are their options down the road if they say in 10 or 15 years they want to repurpose that to a different purpose. What is required to do that, or is there a recertification process that needs to be done?
Okay. Every town and village has its own zoning ordinance, but overlaying that is the principle of pre-existing non-conforming uses. So if in a residential district you have a medical office, you can continue that medical office as a medical office, as a pre-existing non-conforming use. You can't change it to another non-conforming use. And if you stop using it as a non-conforming use for over a year, you're deemed to have abandoned that pre-existing non-conforming use and have to comply with the zoning as it exists then, whatever it is. If it's was a two-family zone with a pre-existing non-conforming use of a medical office, and over the course of that use, it becomes a one-family zone. When you abandon that pre-existing non-conforming use, your only right is to use it as a one-family use. You can ask for a variance from the local zoning board of appeals. And the zoning board of appeals is different than the planning board. Planning board and the zoning board of appeals are different. They're side by side in each jurisdiction.
And I'm guessing that process takes a certain amount of time depending on the town. So you'd have to plan ahead if you're planning to repurpose the building.
We're repurposing to another non-conforming use is generally a non-starter, because it's the intent of the ordinance to eliminate pre-existing non-conforming uses.
Okay. Okay. We also had a follow-up question on triple net leases. If someone wanted to find out more information about them, where would you suggest that they go, particularly in terms of all the costs associated with them?
Google, but if you're starting a business and you're not going to have a long-term lease with a very rich backer, stay away from them.
Okay.
They are lengthy documents. They are complicated documents. You worry about things like condemnation, restoration after fire and casualty. They can run 80 pages long and can be fought over by lawyers for months at a time.
Yeah. We only have a couple minutes left, but one thing that might be of interest, what are the biggest or the simplest mistakes that you see people making who are entering lease agreements as a small business for the first time?
Not reading.
Not understanding the agreements thoroughly?
No, not trying to understand the lease. Leases are basically contracts. And most of the other things, the legal aspects of a contract are usually in favor of the landlord, and the courts are reluctant to enforce default and forfeiture provisions. The courts tend to lean over backwards to help the tenants, but you have to read the lease. If the lease says, if you're late in your payments and you rent 2 times, you lose your right to renew the lease, that's pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
As Bob Dylan would say, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows.
And then I guess the last question would be, it does appear like there's a lot of vacancies right now in commercial real estate. If you are looking to enter a lease, what are the best things that you can negotiate for to take advantage of that current situation?
Always how to make the box bigger, how to make it smaller. In other words, a renewal right, a contraction right, an expansion right, as well as free rent and a work allowance. In the end, it comes down to space and money.
Got it. Well, I want to thank you for the presentation today. It's very informative. It's obviously a popular topic. We had over 150 people registered for this. I'd also like to thank the SBA for helping to sponsor this event with SCORE. They make it possible for us to do these educational webinars and in-person events. If you do have suggestions for other topics that you would like to see in the future, please use the email address or the phone number to submit those, and we'll see what we can do. Andy, I want to thank you again. It's a good presentation, and I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.